In 2008, capitalism suffered its second major global contraction, causing a chain reaction that plunged Europe into a recessionary spiral that is still threatening Europeans with a vortex of permanent depression, cynicism, disintegration, and misanthropy. The current European crisis is not only a threat to workers, the dispossessed, bankers, particular groups, social classes, or even nations. No, Europe's current attitude poses a serious threat to civilization as we know it today. If my prognosis is correct, and the European crisis is not just another cyclical downturn that will soon be overcome as profit rates rise following the inevitable fall in wages, the issue on the agenda for radical thinkers is this: should we welcome this total stalemate of European capitalism as an opportunity to replace it with a better system? Or should we be so concerned about it that we embark on a campaign to stabilize European capitalism? The European crisis is, as I see it, pregnant not with potential progressive alternatives, but with radically regressive forces that would have the capacity to cause a humanitarian bloodbath, extinguishing the hope of any progressive action for generations to come. Confessions of an Irregular Marxist. In May 2013 I had the pleasure of covering this topic during the 6th Subversive Festival in Zagreb. Only now have I been able to write it down and expand on some significant aspects. Yannis Varoufakis. Confessions of a Irregular Marxist. In the middle of a repulsive European economic crisis. Rios. Index. 1. Introduction. A radical confession. 2. Why am I a Marxist? 3. Science fiction becomes documentary. 4. What did Marx do for us? 5. Why heretic? Marx's 2 unforgivable errors. 6. Mr. Keynes's radical idea. 7. Mrs. Thatcher's lesson for today's European radicals. 8. Conclusion. What is the task of Marxists? Bibliography. 1. Introduction. A radical confession. In 2008, capitalism suffered its second major global contraction, causing a chain reaction that plunged Europe into a recessionary spiral that is still threatening Europeans with a vortex of permanent depression, cynicism, disintegration, and misanthropy. Over the past 3 years, I have had the opportunity to express myself on Europe's difficult moment in front of extremely varied audiences. Thousands of anti-austerity demonstrators in Syntagma Square in Athens, staff of the Federal Reserve in New York, Green MEPs in the European Parliament, Bloomberg analysts in London and New York, students in the deprived suburbs of Athens and New York, the House of Commons in London, Syriza activists in Thessaloniki, mutual fund owners in Manhattan and London. The list is as long as European leaders retreat from humanist principles, and the reason for such interventions continues to persist. Despite the heterogeneity of the audiences, the message has always been one: the current European crisis is not only a threat to workers, the dispossessed, bankers, particular groups, social classes, or even nations. No, Europe's current attitude poses a serious threat to civilization as we know it today. If my prognosis is correct, and the European crisis is not just another cyclical downturn that will soon be overcome as profit rates rise following the inevitable fall in wages, the issue on the agenda for radical thinkers is this: should we welcome this total stalemate of European capitalism as an opportunity to replace it with a better system? Or should we be so concerned about it that we embark on a campaign to stabilize European capitalism? My response over these 3 years has been clear, and its substance has been misinterpreted by the aforementioned list of diverse audiences I have attempted to influence. The European crisis is, as I see it, pregnant not with potential progressive alternatives, but with radically regressive forces that would have the capacity to cause a humanitarian bloodbath, extinguishing the hope of any progressive action for generations to come. Because of this theory, by radical voices in good faith, I have been accused of defeatism, an out-of-time Menshevik who fights tirelessly in favor of analyses whose aim would be to save an indefensible European socio-economic system. A system that represents everything a radical should condemn and fight: an anti-democratic, irreversibly neoliberal, highly irrational, transnational European Union, which has virtually no chance of evolving into a sincerely humanist community in which European nations can breathe, live, and develop. This criticism, I confess, hurts me. And it hurts me because it contains more than part of the truth. Indeed, I share the vision of this European Union as a fundamentally anti-democratic and irrational institution that is leading the people of Europe down a path of misanthropy, conflict, and permanent recession. And I also bow to the criticism that I am fighting on an agenda that is based on the assumption that the left was, and remains, completely defeated. And so yes, in this sense, I feel forced to accept the fact that I would like my goals to be of another type. I would much rather promote a program whose raison d'etre is the replacement of European capitalism with a different, more rational system, rather than striving only to stabilize European capitalism, which conflicts with my definition of the good society. At this point, perhaps it may be pertinent to introduce a second confession, to confess that, confessions always tend to be self-centered. In fact, the confessions are always very similar to what John von Neumann once said about Robert Oppenheimer after hearing that his former director in the Manhattan Project had turned into an anti-nuclear activist and confessed to feeling guilty for his contribution to the carnage in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. John von Neumann's caustic words were, "He is confessing sin to claim its glory." Thank goodness, I am not Oppenheimer and, as a result, it will not be difficult to avoid claiming various sins as an attempt at self-promotion but, rather, as a window from which to glimpse my visions of a crisis-obsessed European capitalism, deeply irrational and repugnant, the explosion of which, despite its many evils, should be avoided at all costs. It is a confession with which to convince radicals that we are called to a contradictory mission, to arrest the free fall of European capitalism in order to gain the time needed to formulate the alternative. 2. Why am I a Marxist? When I chose the topic of my doctoral thesis in 1982, I intentionally chose a highly mathematical topic and a topic in which Marx's thought was irrelevant. When I later embarked on an academic career, as a professor in mainstream economics departments, the implicit contract between me and the departments that offered me to lecture was that I would cover those topics in economic theory that left no room for Marx. In the late 1980s, without my knowledge, I was hired at the University of Sydney in order to eliminate another left-wing candidate. Then, after my return to Greece in 2000, I combined my efforts with those of George Papandreou, trying to remove the risk of the return to power of a resurgent right determined to return Greece to an attitude of xenophobia, both as regards domestic politics, with a crackdown on migrant workers, and in foreign policy issues. As the whole world now knows, Mr. Papandreou's party not only failed to combat xenophobia but, instead, promoted the most virulent free market macroeconomic policies commanded by the so-called Eurozone bailout plans, unintentionally causing the Nazis to return to the streets of Athens. Although I had resigned as an advisor to Mr. Papandreou in early 2006, and had become one of the government's most insistent critics during its poor handling of the post-2009 Greek implosion, my interventions in the public debate in Greece and in Europe, for example the modest proposal to resolve the euro crisis, of which I co-authored and for which I fought, did not contain the slightest trace of Marxism. By virtue of this long path through universities and political debates in Europe, one might be surprised to see me pull the proverbial secret out of the drawer by declaring myself a Marxist. Such statements do not come naturally to me. I wish I could avoid heterodefinitions, i.e. being defined based on someone else's method and worldview. Marxist, Hegelian, Keynesian, Humean, I would naturally be inclined to say that I am none of these things, that I spent my time trying to become Francis Bacon's bee, a creature that collects nectar from millions of flowers and transforms it, in its stomach, into something new, something personal, something that is indebted to every single flower but which is not defined by any of them taken individually. But, alas, this would be false, and therefore not a good way to start a confession. To be sure, Karl Marx was responsible for shaping my perspective of the world we live in, from my childhood to the present day. It's not something I would willingly talk about much in today's polite society because the mere mention of the word that begins with M extinguishes any interest in the audience. But it's something I've never even denied. In fact, after a few years spent addressing audiences with whom I did not share the ideological background, a need has recently arisen in me to speak candidly about Marx's influence on my thinking. To explain why to be an unrepentant Marxist, I think it is important to resist him ardently on many topics. To be, in other words, heretical in one's Marxism. If my academic career has largely ignored Marx, and my current political advice is impossible to describe as Marxist, then why bring up my Marxism now? The answer is simple: even my non-Marxist economic views are guided by a mindset heavily influenced by Marx. I have always thought that a radical social theorist can challenge dominant economic thinking in two different ways. One is through the path of immanent critique. Accept the dominant axioms and then expose their internal contradictions. Saying, I don't dispute your assumptions, but here's why your conclusions don't follow logically from those. This was, in fact, the method used by Marx to undermine the system of British political economy. Marx accepted every single axiom of Adam Smith and David Ricardo in order to demonstrate that, in the context of their assumptions, capitalism was a contradictory system. The second path that a radical theorist can pursue is, of course, that of constructing alternative theories to those of the establishment, hoping that they will be taken seriously, which is what late 20th century Marxist economists are doing. My opinion on this double alternative has always been that the powers in office are never disturbed by theories that start from assumptions different from their own. No establishment economist will ever pay attention to a Marxist or neo-Ricardian model these days. The only thing that can destabilize and seriously challenge mainstream neoclassical economists is the demonstration of the inconsistency of their own models. It is for this reason that, from the beginning, I chose to penetrate the bowels of neoclassical theory and to expend almost no energy in attempting to develop alternative, Marxist models of capitalism. My reasons, I admit, were rather Marxist. 1. When pushed to comment on the world we live in, as opposed to the dominant ideology on the functioning of the global economy, I had no alternative but to return to the Marxist tradition that had shaped my thinking since my father, a metallurgist, had imprinted on me, when I was still a child, the importance of technological changes and innovations in the historical process. Like, for example, the transition from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age speeded up history, how the discovery of steel accelerated historical time tenfold, and how silicon-based computing technologies are historical and socio-economic discontinuities of primary importance. This constant triumph of human reason over nature and technological means, which also periodically serves to expose the backwardness of our social superstructures and relationships, is an irreplaceable perspective that I owe to Marx. His historical materialism was reinforced in the most interesting and unexpected way. Anyone who has watched the Star Trek Voyager episode titled In the Blink of an Eye will recognize a wonderful 45-minute depiction of historical materialism at work, an impressive narrative of the process by which the development of the means of production generates technological advances that constantly question superstition and create historical impulses that, in a nonlinear manner, generate new phases of civilization. My first encounter with Marx's texts came very early in my life, as a result of the strange times in which I found myself growing up, with Greece intent on emerging from the nightmare of the neo-fascist dictatorship of 1967 to 1974. What caught my attention was Marx's unsurpassed, fascinating gift in portraying human history as a play, in which human damnation is redeemed by a real possibility of salvation and authentic spirituality. Reading sentences like, "Modern bourgeois society with its bourgeois conditions of production and exchange, bourgeois property relations, a society that has conjured up such powerful means of production and exchange as if by magic, resembles the sorcerer who can no longer dominate the underground powers evoked by him." The Communist Manifesto, 1848. It almost seemed like we were attending a meeting between, on the one hand, Faust and Dr. Frankenstein, and on the other, Adam Smith and David Ricardo, in the creation of a narrative populated by figures, workers, capitalists, officials, scientists, who they were the dramatic actors of history, agents who fought to harness reason and science to make humanity stronger while, contrary to their intentions, unleashed infernal forces that usurped and subverted their freedom and humanity. This dialectical perspective, in which everything generates its opposite, and the keen eye with which Marx identified the potential for change in the seemingly most fixed and immutable social structures, helped me to grasp the great contradictions of the capitalist era. It dissolved the paradox of an age that generated the most remarkable conditions of well-being and, at the same time, the blackest poverty. Today, turning to the European crisis, the crisis of American achievement, the long-term stagnation of Japanese capitalism, almost all commentators fail to grasp the dialectical process taking place under their noses. They recognize the mountain of debt and the bank's losses, but they forget the other side of the coin, its antithesis, the mountain of inactive savings that are frozen by fear and therefore do not convert into productive investments. A Marxist attention to binary oppositions would have helped them open their eyes. One of the main reasons why dominant opinion is unable to come to terms with contemporary reality is that it has never understood the dialectical tension of the joint production of debt and surplus, of growth and unemployment, of well-being and poverty, of spirituality and depravity, not to mention good and evil, of new forms of pleasure and slavery, of freedom and submission, of this cauldron of binary oppositions that Marx's dramatic writings showed us as the resources of history's ingenuity. From my first reflections as an economist to today, it has always seemed clear to me that Marx made a discovery that should have remained the central point of any useful analysis of capitalism. This discovery was, of course, that of another binary opposition intrinsic to human work. This has two different natures: 1, work as value creation, vital breath, an activity that can never be specified or quantified in advance, and therefore impossible to commodify, and 2, work as quantity, number of hours of work, used for sale and transformed into a price. This is what distinguishes work from other productive resources such as electricity, its dual, contradictory nature. A contradiction that political economists forgot to make before Marx, and that mainstream economists still firmly refuse to accept today. Both electricity and labor can be thought of as commodities. Employers and workers alike struggle to commodify work. Employers use all their ingenuity, and that of their human resources managers, to quantify, measure and homogenize work. At the same time, prospective employees work their tails off in an anxious attempt to commodify their labor power, writing and rewriting their resumes to portray themselves as providers of quantifiable units of work. And that's the problem. Because if workers and employers could completely commodify labor, capitalism would die. This is a perspective without which capitalism's tendency to generate cyclical crises can never be fully understood, a perspective to which no one without a basic understanding of Marx's thought will ever have access. 3. Science fiction becomes documentary. In a great classic, the 1953 film Invasion of the Body Snatchers, the aliens do not attack us head-on, unlike, for example, what happens in H.G.'s War of the Worlds. Wells. Rather, humans are attacked from within, until nothing of their souls and emotions remains. Their bodies are all that remain, as shells that once contained free will and now work, mechanically move through daily life, and function as human simulacra liberated from the random capriciousness of human nature. This process is equivalent to the transformation needed to turn human labor into an energy source no different from seeds, electricity, indeed robots. Speaking in modern terms, this is what would have happened if human labor had become perfectly reducible to human capital and therefore suitable for inclusion in crude economic models. Think about it. Every single non-Marxist economic theory that treats human and non-human productive impulses as if they were interchangeable, qualitatively equivalent quantities adopts the assumption that the dehumanization of human labor is complete. But if this process were ever to be complete, the result would be the end of capitalism understood as a system capable of creating and distributing value. First, a society of dehumanized simulacra, or automata, would resemble a mechanical clock full of gears and springs, each with its own function, and which overall produce a good, the measurement of time. But if this society contained nothing but automatons, measuring time would not be a good. It would be a product, certainly, but why on earth a good? Without real human beings to experience the clock's workings, there could be no such thing as goods or bads. A society of automatons would be, like mechanical clocks or integrated circuits, full of functioning gears, demonstrating a function which however could not be described either in moral or value terms. Therefore, to recap, if capital were to ever succeed in quantifying, and therefore in completely commodifying, work, as it tries to do at all times, it would also drain it of that indeterministic, recalcitrant human freedom that allows the generation of work. Marx's brilliant revelation about the deepest essence of capitalist crises was precisely this: the more successful capitalism is in converting labor into a commodity, the less value each unit generates, the less profit and, ultimately, the closer the next odious systemic recession of the economy. The portrait of human freedom understood as an economic category is a unique aspect of Marx's thought, making possible a peculiar and astute dramatic and analytical interpretation of capitalism's propensity to descend into recession, even depression, starting from the most unbridled phases of growth. When Marx wrote that work was the living fire that gave shape to things, the transience of things, their temporality, he was making the greatest contribution any economist has ever made to our understanding of the deep contradiction buried within the DNA of capitalism. When he portrayed capital as a force to which we must submit, which develops a cosmopolitan, universal energy, which goes beyond every limit and breaks every bond, and presents itself as the only rule, the only universality, the only limit and the only bond, he was highlighting the reality that labor can be bought through liquid capital, money, in its commodity form, but always carries within itself a desire hostile to the buying capitalist. But Marx was not just making a psychological, philosophical, or political statement. He was, rather, providing a remarkable analysis of why when work, understood as a non-quantifiable activity, is stripped of this hostility, it becomes sterile, incapable of producing value. At a time when neoliberals have entangled most people in their theoretical tentacles, incessantly regurgitating the ideology of improving labor productivity in order to increase competitiveness and thus create growth and so on, Marx's analyses they offer a powerful antidote. Capital can never win in its struggle to transform labor into an infinitely elastic and mechanized resource without destroying itself. This is what neither neoliberals nor Keynesians will ever understand. If the entire class of wage earners were annihilated by machinery, wrote Marx, how terrible would this be for capital which, without wage labor, would cease to be what it is. The closer capital gets to its final victory over labor, the more our society resembles that of another science fiction film. A film that was predicted by Karl Marx, The Matrix. What is unique about The Matrix is that, in it, the rebellion of our artifacts is not a simple case of killing the Creator Father. Unlike Frankenstein's thing, which irrationally attacks humans due to its sheer existential anguish, or the machines in the Terminator series, which only want to exterminate all humans to consolidate their future domination over the planet, in The Matrix the empire of machines wants to preserve human existence for its own ends, to keep us alive as a primary resource. Homo sapiens, despite inventing human slavery, and despite our unprecedented history of inflicting unspeakable horrors on our kin, could never have even imagined the despicable role that machines assign us in the Matrix. Stuck in devices that make us immobilized to save energy, the machines force-feed us a mixture of nauseating nutrients designed to intensify heat production. However, the machines soon discover that humans don't last long once their spirit is broken and their freedom infringed. Our curious need for freedom threatens the effectiveness of their human-powered plants. Thus, machines imprison us in what Marx would have called false consciousness. They not only instill nutrients into our bodies, but also the illusions that our spirits crave. Ingeniously, they attach electrodes to our skulls with which they sense, directly into our brains, the virtual, yet profoundly realistic life that we, as humans, would like to live. While our bodies are brutally attached to their power generators, fueling them with electricity from our body's heat, the machine software known as the Matrix fills our minds with visions of an imaginary, illusory, yet plausible and normal life. In this way our bodies, unaware of reality, can live for decades, all to the advantage of the machines, which can thus generate enough energy to sustain their new civilization. The oblivion of humanity thus constitutes a crucial factor in the production of the matrix economy. Machines have acquired dominion over human labor and its products. 3. Thus Marx described the rise of machines, a cross between an ancient Greek tragedy and a Shakespearean one that took place against the backdrop of an industrial revolution in which the few they owned the machines and many made them work. Marx's central point was that, in the universe of capital, we are already transhuman. The matrix is not futurology. It's been part of our reality for a while now. It is the best possible documentary about our era, or, to be precise, about our era's tendency to erase from human work all those characteristics that prevent it from becoming fully flexible, perfectly quantified, infinitely divisible. As for Marx, his role was to provide us with the red pill option, for a chance to face, without the reassuring illusions of bourgeois ideology, the squalid reality of a system that produces crisis and deprivation every day, intentionally and certainly not by chance. Read any management manual, any article in any academic journal of economics, any document produced by the European Union on education, school, university, programs to improve productivity, competitiveness, etc. You will immediately understand that we are already living in our own version of the matrix. Capital's relentless efforts to quantify and usurp labor have infested all of these documents, which sponsor a society in which people aspire to become automatons. An ideology whose programmatic extension is the transformation of human work into a version of thermal energy that allows machines greater operating margins and the construction of other machines which, tragically, will lack any ability to generate value. In this sense, our matrix can only be provisional, since the closer it comes to the perfect version of the film, the more likely it is to trigger a crisis of catastrophic dimensions, and, with the plummet of economic values, the arrival of a great recession, and the role of machines is reversed when investments in them become negative. From this Marxian perspective, returning again to the film, the group of men liberated in the heart of the machine society, which guide the resurgence of human beings, symbolizes human resistance to becoming human capital, the inherent irreducible hostility towards quantification that remains embedded in the hearts and minds of even those who spend all their energies trying to commodify themselves on behalf of their employers. The delicious irony in all this is that this very hostility that capital attempts to eradicate in labor is precisely what makes labor capable of producing value and allows capital to accumulate. 4. What did Marx do for us? On one occasion Paul Samuelson denigrated Marx by calling him a lesser follower of Ricardo. Almost every school of thought, including some progressive economists, would like to pretend that, although Marx was a charismatic figure, very little, if any, of his contributions remain relevant today. I beg to differ. In addition to identifying the fundamental drama of capitalist dynamics, see previous section, Marx provided me with the tools with which to become immune to the toxic propaganda of the neoliberal enemies of true freedom and rationality. For example, the idea that wealth is produced privately and therefore appropriated by an almost illegitimate state through taxation is an idea that is easy to succumb to if one has not come to terms with Marx's acute observation. So exactly the opposite is true. Wealth is produced collectively and therefore made the object of private appropriation through social relations of production and property rights which are based, for their reproduction, almost exclusively on false consciousness. The same goes for the concept of autonomy that sounds so good in our postmodern world. It too is produced collectively, through the dialectic of mutual recognition, and therefore made the object of privatization. If only Marx had been taken seriously, by Marxists even before by his detractors, it must be said, much of the hot air produced in the history of the annals of cultural studies would have been avoided. Phil Morosky recently highlighted, quite convincingly, the success of neoliberals in convincing large sections of people that the market is not only a useful means, but also an inalienable end in itself. That while collective action and public institutions are never capable of doing the right thing, the unrestricted operations of decentralized private interest generate a kind of secular divine providence that guarantees the production not only of desired outcomes, but also of desires, of character, of even desired ethics. The best example of neoliberal grossness is, of course, the debate over climate change and what to do to stop it. Neoliberals have been quick to argue that if something is to be done at all, it is necessary for this something to take the form of some sort of waste market, such as, for example, an emissions trading market, since only markets they know how to appropriately value goods and waste. To understand both why such a solution is destined to fail and, more importantly, where the motivation for certain solutions comes from, it is sufficient to acquire a minimum of familiarity with the logic of capital accumulation underlined by Marx and which Michael Kalecki has adapted to a world governed by connected oligopolies. In the 20th century, the two political movements that had their roots in Marx's thought were the Communist and Social Democratic parties. Both, in addition to their other mistakes, and even crimes, failed, to their detriment, to follow Marx's lead on one crucial issue. Instead of embracing freedom and rationality as their watchwords and organizing concepts, they opted for equality and justice, leaving freedom to the neoliberal camp. Marx was adamant, the problem of capitalism is not its injustice, but its irrationality, because it condemns entire generations to poverty and unemployment and even transforms the capitalists themselves into automatons oppressed by anguish, enslaved by the machines they nominally own, forced to live in perpetual fear of ceasing to be capitalists, unless we can completely commodify other humans so as to subject them more efficiently to the service of capital accumulation. Thus, if capitalism appears unjust, it is only because it enslaves everyone in the manner of the matrix, be they workers or capitalists, squanders natural and human resources, produces serious unhappiness, slavery, and crises from the same production chain that generates notable innovations and well-being never seen before. Having failed to hint at a critique of capitalism in terms of freedom and rationality, which Marx believed to be fundamental, social democracy and the left in general allowed neoliberals to usurp the baton of freedom and achieve a decisive triumph on the cultural and ideological. 2. Remaining on the question of neoliberal triumph, perhaps its most significant dimension is that of the so-called democratic deficit. Rivers of crocodile tears have been shed over the decline of our great democracies over the past 3 decades of financialization and globalization. Marx would have loudly and at length mocked those who seem surprised, or troubled, by the democratic deficit. What was the great goal of 19th-century liberalism? It was, as Marx never tired of pointing out, the separation of the economic sphere from the political one and the confinement of politics to the second, leaving the economic sphere to capital. What we are observing today is nothing other than the splendid success of liberalism in achieving this long-sought goal. Take a look at South Africa today, more than 20 years after Mandela was freed and the political sphere finally embraced the entire population. The difficult situation of the ANC was that in order to dominate the political sphere it had to accept impotence in the economic one. And if you think of it another way, I suggest you talk to the scores of miners shot to death by armed guards paid off by their masters after they dared to ask for a pay rise. 5. Why heretic? Marx's 2 unforgivable errors. Having explained why I owe any understanding of our social world that I may have primarily to Karl Marx, I now want to explain why I am terribly angry with him. In other words, I would like to underline why I am by choice a heretical, dissenting Marxist. These errors are important in this context because they hinder the left's effectiveness in organizing against misanthropy, particularly in Europe. Marx's first error, which I suggest is due to an omission, is that he was insufficiently dialectical, insufficiently reflective. He failed to give sufficient thought, and to maintain a judicious silence, about the impact of his own theories on the world about which he was theorizing. His theory is narratively exceptionally powerful, and Marx was aware of this power. How come he didn't worry that his disciples, people with a better understanding of these powerful ideas than the average worker, might use the power given to them to abuse their comrades, to build their own power base, to gain positions of influence, to take advantage of impressionable students, etc. To provide a second example, we know that the success of the Russian Revolution forced capitalism, in due course, to make a strategic retreat and allow social security plans, national health services, and even the idea of forcing the rich to pay for masses of poor students could study in schools and universities built for the purposes of the liberals. At the same time, we have also seen how angry hostility towards the Soviet Union, first revealed in a series of invasions, spread paranoia among socialists and created a climate of fear that proved particularly fertile for figures like Joseph Stalin and Pol Pot. Marx never saw the realization of this dialectical process. He simply did not consider the possibility that the creation of a workers' state would cause capitalism to become more civilized while the workers' state would be infected by the virus of totalitarianism and the hostility of the rest of the capitalist world towards it would grow ever greater. More. Marx's second error, the one I consider to be one of commission, is worse. It was his assumption that the truth about capitalism could be discovered in the mathematics of his models, so-called schemes of reproduction. This was the worst service Marx could ever have rendered to his own theoretical system. The man who taught us to consider human freedom a fundamental economic concept, the scholar who elevated radical indeterminacy to its rightful place within political economy, was the same person who ended up dabbling with simplistic algebraic models, in which the units of labor were, obviously, entirely quantified, hoping against all odds to deduce from these equations other insights into capitalism. Since his death, Marxist economists have wasted entire careers indulging in similar types of scholastic machinery, going the way of what Nietzsche once described as badly functioning pieces of machinery. Completely immersed in irrelevant debates about the problem of transformation and what to do about it, they eventually became a near-extinct species, as the devastating neoliberal fury destroyed all dissent in its path. How could Marx delude himself like this? Why didn't he understand that no truth about capitalism can come out of any mathematical model, no matter how brilliant the modeler may be? Didn't he perhaps have the intellectual tools necessary to understand that the capitalist dynamic comes out of that non-quantifiable part of human work, that is, from a variable that can never be defined mathematically? Of course he had them, as he had forged them himself. No, the reason for his mistake is a little more sinister, just like the vulgar economists he so brilliantly admonished, and who continue to dominate economics departments today. He craved the power that mathematical proof could give him. If I'm right, Marx knew what he was doing. He understood, or he had the ability to understand, that a comprehensive theory of value could not be contained in a mathematical model of the growth of a dynamic capitalist economy. He was, I have no doubt about it, aware of the fact that a correct economic theory had to respect Hegel's dictum that the rules about what is indeterminate are themselves indeterminate. In economic terms, this means recognizing that the market power, and therefore the ability to obtain profit, of capitalists is not necessarily reducible to their ability to extract labor from their wage earners, that some capitalists can extract more from a given labor pool or a given community of consumers for reasons that are external to economic theory. But, alas, this recognition would have been equivalent to admitting that his laws were not immutable. He should have acknowledged to the voices opposed to him in the trade union movement that his theory was indeterminate and, therefore, that his statements could not be definitively and unambiguously correct, but rather perpetually provisional. But Marx felt an overwhelming urge to tame people like Citizen Weston, one who dared to worry that a rise in wages, acquired through strike action, might prove a Pyrrhic victory if capitalists raised prices as a result. Instead of simply arguing against people like Weston, Marx was determined to prove with mathematical precision that they were wrong and that they were unscientific, vulgar, not worthy of serious attention. These were the times in which Marx understood, and confessed, that he had erred on the side of determinism. Once he started writing the third volume of Capital, he understood that even a minimal variation, for example admitting different degrees of capital intensity in different sectors, would refute his argument against Weston. But he was so dedicated to his monopoly on the truth that he passed over the matter, astonishingly but too abruptly, imposing into law the axiom that would, in the end, defend his original proof, the one that would deal the fatal blow to Citizen Weston. Strange are the rituals of fatuity, and sad they are when carried out by exceptional minds, such as Karl Marx and a considerable number of his 20th century disciples. This obsession with obtaining a complete, concluded model, the final word, is something I cannot forgive Marx. He revealed himself, in the end, responsible for a large number of errors and, even more, for authoritarianism. Errors and authoritarianism which are largely responsible for the current impotence of the left, understood as a force for good and for control over the abuses of the concepts of reason and freedom perpetrated today by the neoliberal mob. Note 1. See Karl Marx, Wages, Price, and Profit, in which Marx himself recounts his debate with Citizen Weston. 6. Mr. Keynes's radical idea. Keynes was an enemy of the left. He loved the class system that had spawned him, wanted nothing to do, personally, with the rabble of the lower classes, and worked hard and diligently to produce ideas that would allow capitalism to survive against its own odds. Towards potential death drives. Free-spirited, open-minded, a liberal and bourgeois thinker, Keynes had the rare gift of not backing down from challenges to his own assumptions. In the midst of the Great Depression, he was quite happy to break free from the Marshall tradition that was his legacy. Noting that the higher unemployment rose the lower wages became, and that investment refused to rise even after a long period of zero interest rates, he was quick to tear up the textbook and reconsider the fates of capitalism. The radical overhaul of him had to start somewhere. It began when Keynes broke the ranks of his colleagues by doing the unthinkable, by taking up the debate between David Ricardo and Thomas Malthus and taking the side of the clergyman. Unambiguously, during the Great Depression, he wrote, if only Malthus, rather than Ricardo, had been the progenitor of all 19th century economists, what a wiser and wealthier place would the world be today. With this provocative statement, Keynes was adopting neither Malthus' position in favor of aristocratic rentiers nor his theological views on the redemptive power of suffering. Rather, Keynes embraced Malthus' skepticism regarding the desirability of seeking a theory of value that was compatible with the complexity and dynamism of capitalism, and b. Ricardo's conviction, which later also shared Marx, that a persistent depression is incompatible with capitalism. Why doesn't Keynes converge in the direction of Marx, who after all was the first political economist to explain crises as constitutive of the capitalist process? Because the Great Depression was not like other crises of the kind that Marx had described so well. In the first volume of Capital, Marx tells the story of redemptive cyclical recessions due to the double nature of work, and which generate periods of growth which contain yet another collapse which, in turn, causes the subsequent recovery, and so on. But there was nothing redeeming about the Great Depression. The crisis of the 1930s was simply that, a crisis that behaved like a static equilibrium, an economic state that seemed perfectly capable of perpetuating itself, with the anticipated recovery stubbornly refusing to appear on the horizon even after profit rates bounced back response to the collapse of wages and interest rates. The heart of Keynes's discovery of capitalism was twofold. It was an inherently indeterminate system, exhibiting what today's economists would call an infinity of multiple equilibria, some of which were consistent with endemic mass unemployment, and b. It could have plunged into one of these terrible equilibria in the blink of an eye, unpredictably for no reason, solely because of the fear of such an event by a significant portion of capitalists. To put it simply, this means that, regarding the prediction of depressions and their overcoming by market forces, we'll be damned if we know anything about it. It means that we have no way of knowing what capitalism will do tomorrow, even when, in the present, it seems to be growing ever stronger, which could very well suddenly fall and refuse to get up again. Keynes's notion of animal spirits represented an extremely radical idea, capable of capturing the radical indeterminacy at the heart of the capitalist mechanism. An idea introduced for the first time by Marx, with his analyses on the dialectical nature of work, but which, in the process of writing Capital, he abandoned in order to establish his theorems as mathematical and indisputable proofs. Of all the passages in Keynes' general theory, this idea, that of the self-destructive capriciousness of capitalism, is the one that we must recover and use to radicalize Marxism again. 7. Mrs. Thatcher's lesson for today's European radicals. I moved to England to attend university in September 1978, about 6 months before Mrs. Thatcher's victory that changed the United Kingdom forever. The vision of the disintegration of the Labour government, buried under the weight of its degenerate social democratic programme, led me to a fatal mistake, thinking that perhaps Mrs. Thatcher's victory would be a good thing, because it would bring benefits to the middle class and the working class. The short and violent shock needed to reinvigorate progressive policies, giving the left a chance to rethink their positions and create a new, radical agenda for a new kind of effective progressive policies. Even as unemployment doubled and then tripled under Mrs. Thatcher's radical neoliberal interventions, I continued to hold out hope that Lenin was right, things have to get worse for them to get better. As existence became harder, and, for many, shorter, I realized I was tragically wrong, things could get perpetually worse, without ever getting better. The hope that the deterioration of public goods, the decrease in the living standards of the majority, the spread of poverty in every corner of the country could lead, automatically, to a rebirth of the left was just this, hope. The reality, however, was turning out to be tragically different. With each turn of the screw in the recession, the left became increasingly inward-looking, less able to produce a convincing progressive agenda, and, in the meantime, the working class became divided between those marginalized by society and those co-opted by the new neoliberal order. The concept that a worsening of objective conditions would somehow give rise to subjective conditions such that a new political revolution would arise from them was absolutely false. All that came out of Thatcherism were hucksters, extreme financialization, the triumph of supermarkets over local shops, the fetishization of the home, and Tony Blair. Instead of radicalizing British society, the recession so carefully planned by Mrs. Thatcher's government, as part of its class warfare against organized labor and the public institutions of social security and redistribution that had been established soon after the war, permanently destroyed the very possibility of radical and progressive politics in the UK. In fact, it made the very notion of values that transcend what the market determined as the right price inconceivable. The bitter lesson Mrs. Thatcher taught me about the ability of a long-term recession to undermine progressive policies and instill misanthropy into the fibers of society is a lesson I carry with me in the midst of today's European crisis. It is, in fact, what determines more than anything else my position in relation to the Euro crisis, which has occupied my time and thoughts almost exclusively in recent years. And it is the reason why I am happy to confess the sin attributed to me by radical critics of my Menshevik position on the Eurozone, the sin of choosing not to propose radical political programs in order to exploit the Euro crisis as an opportunity to overthrow European capitalism, to dismantle the hateful Eurozone and to strike at the heart of the European Union of economic cartels and corrupt bankers. Yes, I would like to place such a radical agenda as a priority. But, no, I'm not ready to make the same mistake twice. What advantages did we gain in the UK in the early 1980s in promoting an agenda of socialist change that British society despised as it fell headlong into Mrs. Thatcher's neoliberal trap? Nobody. What good would come today from preaching the dismantling of the Eurozone, of the European Union itself, when European capitalism is doing everything it can to dismantle the Eurozone, the European Union, even itself? A Greek, Portuguese, or Italian exit from the Eurozone would soon turn into a fragmentation of European capitalism, producing a region in deep recession east of the Rhine and north of the Alps, while the rest of Europe would lie in a swamp with no escape from economic stagnation and inflation. Who do you think would profit from this situation? A progressive left, rising from the ashes of European public institutions like a phoenix? Or the Nazis of Golden Dawn, the various neo-fascists, the xenophobes, and the manipulatives? I have absolutely no doubts about it. I'm not ready to push for this postmodern version of the 1930s. If this means that it is our job, the heretical Marxists, to save European capitalism from itself, so be it. Not out of love or appreciation for European capitalism, the Eurozone, Brussels, or the European Central Bank, but only because we want to minimize the superfluous human tolls of this crisis, the countless lives whose prospects would be further destroyed without any benefit to future generations in Europe. 8. Conclusion: what is the task of Marxists? Europe's elites are behaving today like a hapless company of incompetent leaders who understand nothing either of the nature of the crisis over which they are presiding or of its implications for their own destiny, let alone that of the future of European civilization. Driven by their atavistic instincts, European leaders are choosing to plunder the dwindling wealth of the poor and exploit it in order to plug the sinkholes caused by their failed bankers, refusing to accept the impossibility of the attempt. After having created a monetary union that removed from the European macroeconomy all possible instruments capable of cushioning shocks and ensured that, when the shock arrived, it would become of enormous proportions, they are doing their utmost to deny reality, hoping, irrationally, for some miracle brought about by the gods after the sacrifice of a sufficient number of human lives on the altar of austerity and competition. Every time the Troika bailiffs visit Athens, Dublin, Lisbon, Madrid, with every pronouncement of the European Central Bank or the European Commission on the next phase of austerity that will have to be put into practice by Paris or Rome, Bertolt Brecht's words come to mind: brute force has gone out of fashion. Why send hired killers when bailiffs can do the same job? The point is, how can we resist it? Always aware of the left's collective guilt for the industrial feudalism to which we have condemned millions of people for decades in the name of progressive policies, I would nevertheless like to formulate a parallel between the Soviet Union and the European Union. Despite their great differences, they have one thing in common: the uniform party line that flows seamlessly from the top, the Politburo or the Commission, to the base, every young minister of every member state, or every junior commissioner importance, which parrots the same futilities. Both the Soviet Union and the European Union apparatus share a religious sect-like determination to accept the facts only if you agree with the prophecies and their sacred texts. Mr. Al-Iran, for example, who is the member of the European Commission responsible for economic and financial issues, recently had the audacity to accuse the International Monetary Fund for revealing some errors in the calculation of the Eurozone's fiscal multipliers because such a revelation undermined the trust of European citizens in their institutions. Not even Leonid Brezhnev would have dared to make such a statement publicly. With Europe's elites in disarray, denying reality with their heads in the sand like ostriches, the left must admit that we are simply not ready to bridge the chasm that a collapsing European capitalism will open with a functioning socialist system, capable of creating shared well-being for the masses. Our objective must therefore be twofold: to carry out an analysis of the current state of affairs that non-Marxists, i.e. Europeans seduced in good faith by the sirens of neoliberalism, can find agreeable. And follow up this solid analysis with proposals to stabilize Europe, to end the recessionary spiral that will, in the end, only strengthen the intolerant and incubate the snake's eggs. Ironically, we who abhor the Eurozone have a moral obligation to save it. This is what we tried to do with our modest proposal. 1. Addressing heterogeneous audiences ranging from radical activists to hedge fund managers, the idea is to create strategic alliances even with right-wing people with whom we share a simple interest, an interest in ending the vicious cycle between austerity and crisis, between bankrupt states and bankrupt banks, a vicious cycle that damages capitalism as much as any progressive program capable of replacing it. This is why I defend my attempts to enlist people like Bloomberg and New York Times journalists, conservative members of the British Parliament, and financiers who are concerned about the tragic situation in Europe to the cause of the modest proposal. The reader will allow me to conclude with two final confessions. While I am happy to defend the purpose of the system stabilizing program I propose as sincerely radical, I do not claim to be enthusiastic about it. This is what we must do, driven by today's circumstances, but I regret to say that I probably won't have time to see a more radical program adopted. Finally, a confession of a more strictly personal nature, I know that I run the risk of surreptitiously alleviating the sadness of abandoning all hope of replacing capitalism in the course of my existence by indulging in the feeling of having become pleasant in the eyes of the members to the circles of good society. The sense of personal satisfaction in being honored by the rich and powerful began to creep up on me from time to time. And it is an absolutely bad, non-radical feeling, which almost smacks of corruption. My personal nadir came at an airport. A wealthy group had invited me to give a keynote speech on the European crisis and had shelled out the considerable sum needed to buy me a first-class plane ticket. On the way home, tired and already back from several flights, I was making my way through the long line of economy-class passengers to reach my boarding gate. I suddenly realized, with considerable horror, how easy it was for my mind to become infected with this feeling of being allowed to overtake the masses. I realized how easy it was for me to forget what my left-wing thinking had always known, that nothing reproduces itself better than a false sense of power. By building alliances with reactionary forces, as I think we should do to stabilize Europe today, we run the risk of being co-opted, of throwing away our radicalism in exchange for the pleasant sensation of having arrived in the corridors of power. Radical confessions, like the one I have just attempted to make, are perhaps the only programmatic antidote to the ideological slips that threaten to transform us into cogs in the system. If we have to make pacts with the devil, with the International Monetary Fund, with the neoliberals who, despite this, are against what they call the dictatorship of the failed banks, etc., we must avoid becoming like the socialists who failed to change the world but they managed to improve their personal situation. The trick is to avoid the revolutionary maximalism that ultimately helps neoliberals circumvent any opposition to their self-destructive evil but at the same time maintain our view of capitalism as intrinsically evil while trying to save it, for strategic reasons, from itself. Radical confessions can be helpful in maintaining this difficult balance. After all, humanist Marxism is a constant struggle against what we are becoming.